to the point that when we hear them, we kind of just go into autopilot sometimes. When we hear a story about the 10 plagues or about Jesus' death, we say, I've heard this. And we kind of go into autopilot and think about what we're going to have for lunch and what else is going to come next. But today, as we look at one of these stories, I want to encourage you that whether you're looking at the story for the first time or for the 1,000th time, that look at it with open eyes and an open heart to what God wants to show to you, because there's always more wisdom and more truth that we can find. So this morning, turn with me to Daniel chapter 6 as we read one of the most famous kid stories, one of the most famous Bible stories, Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it a connection with the law of his God. So at this point, Daniel has been incredibly blessed that he came in as an exile and he chose not to eat the king's food, but instead he ate vegetables. And his friends were blessed that when they went to the fiery furnace, they weren't killed, but they came out. That God has continued to bless Daniel to the point that he is now a high official and about to be promoted to the highest official. Very similar to how Joseph was in Egypt with Pharaoh. That God was blessing Daniel because of his faithfulness. That's a big part of what this whole story is based on, that Daniel has consistently been faithful. And we see that again in verse 5. It says, and then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless it is in his relationship with God. That Daniel loved God so much that the only way they could accuse him was because of that connection. They knew how devoted he was to God, that if anything came between him and God, God was going to win. And I think that's so cool. And how is that for us? If people were to come accuse us of something, would they say, this person cheats on their taxes? This person speeds. This person does this, does that. Or would they have to rely upon this person loves God so much and that's the only thing that we can use? That Daniel's enemies, Daniel's friends, all knew that Daniel was devoted to God because that is what he constantly did. Is that what we as people do? Are we that devoted to God? Or if people were to come accuse us, God would be the furthest thing that they would use. For Daniel, it was God. And we continue reading in verse 6. And it says, and then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction, that is a decree, a law, that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. So these people were mad at Daniel and wanted him out of power because they wanted to be there. So they come before the king and they say, this is what we want you to do. But it's interesting how they phrase it. In verse 7, we see that they say, all the high officials of the kingdom and the prefects and so on and so forth. Except we know that Daniel was a high official. And Daniel wouldn't have agreed to this law. So these people here have come before him saying lies and using God as a weapon of attack against Daniel. These people were doing whatever they could to get Darius to put this into law so that Daniel could be removed. These people were bad people. Then we come to verse 10. And then Daniel, when he knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in the upper chamber, open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before God. They came near and said to the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" The king answered and said, "The thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they answered and said before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." So Daniel, when hearing this law had come in, goes to his home and prays as he has done every day before and will continue to do every day after. And I wonder how that first prayer would have been. When he hears this law and he hears that if you prayed to your God, you're going to die. And Daniel goes and he gets down on his knees and he prays. Would that prayer have been filled with asking God for peace, asking God for safety? Would it have been filled with tears? Would it have been filled with something else? I don't know. But what we know is that regardless of any consequences, of any stress, of any pressure, of anything else, Daniel continued to pray. And then these people that were accusing Daniel, they went and found Daniel when he was praying. That Daniel's prayer life was so well known to his friends and to his enemies that they knew when he would be praying. And I think that that's so cool, that this was so overflowing out of him that everybody knew. And I wonder how that would be for us. Would our friends and our coworkers know that at 9 and 10 we're here for Bible class and worship every Sunday morning? Could they come and find us here? But more than that, could they find us more than just one day out of the week? Could they say that at 6 a.m. that he's there with his Bible? Or at 5 p.m. she's there and she's praying to God? Or at 9 p.m. they're there reading and praying together? Parents, could your kids say, "Yeah, we see our parents read and pray. We know that they do it here, they do it there, they do it at this time"? Could your coworkers, could your friends, could the people that you barely know say this about you? Not because you're bragging or boasting, but because your prayer and your worship is so overflowing that it just continually comes out that everybody knows about it. Because for Daniel it was. God was so important that everybody knew. And these people that despised him said this is when he's going to be there. And down in verse 13, I want to point one more thing out. That these people that despised him, when they bring him before the king, the way they describe him is they say, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah." They don't say Daniel, this high official. They don't say Daniel, this person that you know so much. But they try to reduce Daniel to nothing, even though God has lifted him up. And what we're going to see as we keep reading this story is that regardless of these people trying to knock Daniel down, they cannot withstand a God who has lifted him up. So let's keep reading in verse 14 and see what Darius does when Daniel has broken this decree. In verse 14 it says, "And then the king, when he had heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored until the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, 'Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed.' Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions." So Darius tried to find any way around this. He tried to figure out some way to get Daniel to be free, even though he was king and he could have said, "Daniel's not going there." But when he looked at the consequences of breaking this law, it meant that he may have been killed. He may have lost his kingship. And when he looked at these things, he said it's not worth it. And he instead sent Daniel into the den of lions. And in the second part of verse 16, the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the signet of his lords, and nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" So Darius sends Daniel to this lion's den. But when he does this, he goes to his home and he is fasting. He's not able to sleep. He's not able to eat. We know that there is something that is upsetting him, that there is either guilt or stress or something that is not letting him be able to rest. It's almost like Darius knew what he did was wrong. And I think that we can see that more in verse 16 where he tells Daniel, "May your God deliver you." And again in verse 20 where he cries out to Daniel, "Daniel, has your God, the living God, saved you?" Darius isn't a Christian, but he does know that Daniel's God is powerful. So it's almost like he finally realizes that I should not have sent Daniel there. I should have kept him out. And as he runs to it, he's hoping that Daniel isn't dead, that maybe he's alive somehow, that his mistake isn't permanent, but that Daniel is still okay. And in verse 21, then Daniel responds, and he says, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found to be blameless before God and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken out, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Then the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all of their bones. When we read this story to our kids, we probably leave that last part out. We probably have a coloring page where we see Daniel with this nice little lion, and he's petting him, and he looks like a cute little cat. But these lions were ravenous beasts that had teeth that were sharp, that had paws and claws that could kill and maim and destroy. And to these people, they did. And the reason I think this is important is because when we read this story, it's not like Daniel knew he was going to go in and it was going to be perfectly fine. But he knew that these creatures had the ability to kill. So when he chose to continue to follow God, it was with the full intention that I might die. But God saved Daniel from this lion's den. And this is what we finish this story with. In verse 25, "And then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, languages that dwell in all of the earth, 'Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all of my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. For he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. What's really cool is that this story gets flipped around. At the very beginning, Darius is faced with this challenge of what am I going to do? And he follows the law and sends Daniel to the lion's den. But Darius gets a second chance and he is able to pull out Daniel. And this time the law isn't worship only me, but now it is worship the true God. He does what is right, which is so cool. So as we look at this story, we see that this is a struggle against earthly authorities. That sometimes earthly authorities combat what God says. So I want to look at 4 different responses that people in this story had. At first, we look at Daniel, that we know that God said something and the king said something else. And Daniel said, I pick God. That I pray this is how we are, that when the world has a law that is different than what God says, that we choose God regardless of the consequences, whether that means that we lose our job, lose our friends, whether that means that we lose anything else, even our life, that we continue to choose God. But I like what Daniel says when he is coming up out of the lion's den. He says, I have been blameless before y'all, before God and before you, O king. That for Daniel, that he had been a loyal servant to the king. That is the reason that he had been rising through the ranks and was about to be the highest official. So for Daniel, when a law came that said you have to pay these taxes, or you have to wear this mask, or you have to drive this speed limit even though everybody else is going 20 or 30 over, that we follow the laws that are there. That Daniel did that even when it was annoying, probably inconvenient. Didn't make sense. As long as it wasn't against God, Daniel did it. This is very similar to Romans 13, where it says, obey the earthly authorities because they're placed there by God. Daniel didn't have blame against God or against the king. But then we look at the second person that responds to authority. We look at Darius. That Darius, when he is presented with this law and he knows that it is wrong, he knows that he shouldn't send Daniel into the lion's den. We see this because he's trying to figure out a way not to. He looks at it and he sees the consequences of what would happen if he follows God. We see that he may lose his kingdom, may be killed, and he says, I can't do it. And he follows the world. And we see that what comes with it is that he is filled with sorrow, he is filled with guilt, with stress, he is upset. And I think that that's sometimes how we are. Or we say, I can't say that homosexuality, I can't say living together before marriage is wrong because that means I may lose my friends, means I may lose my family. Or, I can't not cheat on these taxes and on these papers for my boss because then I lose my job. And we say, God, I can't right now. And we follow the things of the world. And that is going to give us guilt and sorrow. But I love the story of Darius because as we see, he runs to the tomb and Daniel is still alive and he's able to pick him up and he's able to have a second chance. That we see in Darius that we serve a God that is forgiving. That even though we may mess up and we may choose the world at times, that we serve a God that is merciful and loving and says, you can do better the next time. And maybe that means, like Darius, where it's going to be for the specific situation. Or maybe it's the next time that we're presented with a conflict between world and God. But we have a God that is saying, it's okay, do better. And then we look at a third people group. So in chapter 6 and verse 7, this was their famous speech where they said all of the high officials and satraps and prefects agree to this. And we know that they were lying because Daniel, a high official, wouldn't have agreed to this. So I wonder if there were other people that just kind of went along with it, that didn't know that this was a bad decree, that just went along with the crowd. And I think that this is sometimes how we are. That the world says this is what the law says, that what we should do, and we don't know enough of this. And we just go along with it even though God says, don't do this. As Christians, we are called to be in this, to be known, just as Daniel was, that when a command comes down, we can say, God would have no issue with that. Or we can say, God would not allow me to do this. Because we can't just be people that go with the crowd, because those that go with the crowd are still liable to judgment. They're still to be punished, even if they don't know. As Christians, we need to know. But those people who just went with the crowd and who were not knowing are very different than our last group of people that know. These were the ones that maliciously accused Daniel, that they knew that God was more powerful, and that's why they used it against Daniel. And they chose the world's commands because for them this was better. That if they were to follow the world, they would be promoted. They would get the blessings instead of Daniel. I think sometimes this may be us as well. That we say, if I lie on this paper here, nobody's going to know, but my kid will get free college. If I do this, nobody's going to know, but I can get there 5 minutes faster. And we say these little things, and it's about benefiting us. And we say the things that the world can give us are greater than what God can give us. And we may not say those words, but that's what our actions are saying. And we see that these people, even though they may have been blessed on earth, we see that they were thrown into a lion's den and killed and destroyed. Those that are blessed by the world, it doesn't matter how blessed they are in this world, when they get to heaven and they are judged, they will be punished then. Likewise, for those that are like Daniel, that are thrown into the lion's den, we serve a God that is a rescuer, that is a deliverer. And maybe that means from the things that we are going through, but maybe that means when we get to heaven, God will say, well done, and welcome us in to home. So right now, we've looked at these 4 responses, and I pray that not if, but when the world conflicts with God, we choose to be like Daniel. And maybe we're in one of these other places we are supposed to be moving towards being more like Daniel. We don't serve the kings of this world, but we serve ultimately the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So this morning, maybe you're sitting here and you feel like Darius. You feel like you have listened to the world because you're afraid of the consequences for choosing God, and you're sitting here right now and you can't sleep and you have this guilt that is washing over you. We can help. Or maybe you're like those people that maliciously accuse Daniel, and you have been choosing the world because it has been sweeter and it has seemed better than God, and you want to figure out how to choose God instead. We can help you. Or maybe you're like Daniel, where you have chosen to follow God in spite of the world's consequences, and you feel like you're in the lion's den, and you feel like there's no hope, that you feel like you are just over and done. We can help. Or maybe you feel like those last people that you have been choosing the world and you just don't know anything better. And you want to know the Bible better and to know what God says so that you can follow him better. We can help with that. We can help with whatever your need is. Not as people that are perfect, but as people that are every day trying to be more like Daniel together and walking together towards heaven to hear God say, well done. You guys can come forward. You can go to the back. You can find me, any elder, any other church member in here. You guys can find us after church or any other time this week. We are here to help. We just need to know what the need is. I ask that you guys stand as we sing this next song.